And welcome back. As President Trump continues to make inflammatory comments about immigrants and his administration keeps coming up with harsher and harsher crackdowns on that population, we're also seeing that Trump is rallying people, it turns out, believe what he believes. Many people who think that immigrants are the enemy. They feel they have a friend in the White House. Now I'm talking about former Klan leaders like David Duke, but also regular people whose names you may not recognize, like this school teacher in Fort Worth, Texas. Georgia Clark's her name, and she was fired after she tweeted at Trump saying that her school was loaded with undocumented children and that the high school has been taken over by them. She also referred to a, quote, Hispanic assistant principal who's been protecting certain students from criminal prosecution. She wound up getting reinstated, though, after a lengthy court case. But my next guest, he penned a piece in the Washington Post that details the president's role in some of the tensions that we're seeing and how throughout history he's kind of in a unique landscape here. Its headline shows you where he stands. Trump has spread more hatred of immigrants than any American in history. U.S. history is full of nativists, but the president, he's the most powerful one yet. Tyler Anbinder, he's a professor of history at George Washington University. He's kind enough to give us a few minutes. And I got to say, when I went through the piece, I recognized that we've had certainly nativist presidents before, but they've been conscious not to egg on the worst element, if you will. And maybe while they may have supported stuff, they went out of their way that they wouldn't, let's say, have the fingerprints on them, even if they believed, hypothetically, some of the most ugly comments that were out there. We've never really seen anything from a president, at least, like we're seeing from this president.
No, we haven't. President Trump is really the first president to adopt every single facet of the American nativist playbook. He's blamed immigrants for crime, he's blamed immigrants for disease, he's blamed immigrants for unemployment. Pretty much anything bad in the United States, he's blamed immigrants.
In fact, there was a line in your piece I wanted to read because there's that 10 charges against immigrants, and he checked off every box at one point or another as both a candidate as a president. You wrote, Trump's nativism is especially striking for its comprehensiveness. Over the centuries, nativists, they've leveled 10 main charges against immigrants. They bring crime, they import poverty, they spread disease, they don't assimilate, they corrupt our politics, they steal our jobs, they cause our taxes to increase, they're a security risk, their religion is incompatible with American values, and they can never be true Americans. And you go systematically through this piece at one time or another. The president has said these things, but to me what jumps out at me is how it's never to a single portion of a country or a single particular individual. It's so broad, Tyler, in terms of who he levies against. I mean, some of it is he wanted to shut down all Muslims from entering the United States at a certain point. Haitians, all of them, according to the president, have AIDS. Africa, the whole continent is basically S-hole countries, and we know what he said about, folks from south of the border, that they're animals, invaders, murderers, or rapists. It is just throw as big a net as you can over all these particular populations, while at the same time saying, why don't we get some more people from Norway?
Exactly, and one of the striking things that I see as a historian is that this is the kind of thing that's been said about immigrants throughout every period of American history. When the Irish first started coming in large numbers in the wake of the potato famine, Americans said the exact same things about them, and yet they became fine Americans. Later on, the same things were said about German immigrants, about Italian immigrants, about Jewish immigrants, and so forth. And yet all these groups have become important and accepted parts of the American population. And yet Trump insists that these current groups that he's discussing, especially Latin Americans and especially Muslims, can't possibly become true Americans, when history tells us that these groups will become part of the American fabric, just like these other groups, once thought incapable of assimilation, actually did assimilate and become part of the American fabric.
And you know, Professor, one of the things you mentioned among those Irish and Italian, which are two of my ancestors, at least the backgrounds where they come from, you don't have to go back 100 years for the questions of the Italians assimilating. I remember, you go back to even the early 70s, the questions were, would they learn all of them the language? Would they ever concern their kids enough to put them through colleges and the rest, that they're so insular and they don't have the same priorities, I put this in air quotes, that the rest of Americans have? Again, you don't have to go that far back here, even just a single generation. You heard the same complaints about different populations, albeit with different shades of skin.
Absolutely. This is something that Americans have always worried about. The big difference here with President Trump is he's really the first president to not only accept these nativist arguments, but kind of spread them throughout the country. And so at his rallies and through his speeches and through the policies he puts in place, he spreads the idea that certain immigrants can't become good Americans.
And it's connecting this message in that, I mean, we see some of the rallies, but we all remember what happened in Charlottesville in the aftermath. Even abroad, in New Zealand, that gunman who shot a huge population of Muslims, he cited Donald Trump here as a hero, as somebody who understood about the threats that whites were facing, etc. So people believe that the president is echoing their sentiments, even if to the farthest fringe here, and they're white nationalists.
Yeah, it's very tragic that white nationalists see in President Trump an ally, someone whose views in many ways comport with their own, and they believe that their actions, whether it's in New Zealand or whether it's in Texas, are justified because the president is kind of leading the charge for the idea of white supremacy. I'm sure that's not what the president intends, and yet it's the result of his inflammatory rhetoric.
But when he says send her back, you know, talking about Congresswoman Omar and what he said about those 4 congresswomen of color, do you believe that it's just all off the cuff, or he knows what a certain portion of his base wants and he's more than happy to feed it?
That's a great question. It's one I've wondered about. So on the one hand, I think someone like Stephen Miller, his advisor and his point person on immigration, has a great sense of what parts of the immigration issue best touch the president's base. On the other hand, I think the president himself has a great feel for his audiences. That's really one of his strengths. He can sense when he'll sometimes throw off a line at one of his rallies in passing, and when he sees it gets such a great reception, he'll continue with it, and then he'll make it something that he continues with at future talks.
Finally, Professor, you ended your piece on an optimistic note, saying that we've seen this before in the 1850s, 1920s, but at the end of the day, we realize we're better as a country, you know, from the people who go through great obstacles to come here to make America great, if you will. I want you to be right, but don't you see this get worse before it gets better?
One of the promising things, I think, is that there's been kind of a backlash in favor of immigrants as a result of Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric. And so you look at, say, the Gallup poll numbers, and there's never been a higher proportion of Americans who speak favorably about immigrants and immigrants' impact on society than there has been since Trump became president.
In addition to the piece that you folks should check out on Washington Post, our guest has also written several books, including one recently apropos to this, City of Dreams, the 400-year epic history of immigrant New York. An interesting read at that. Tyler, thank you for the time. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on.
All right, everybody, when we come back, some shocking numbers about gun violence that show how big a problem we're talking about here. In the Supreme Court, they heard a case today that could make things even worse. We'll explain after the break.